Acts chapter 6. We already read the text this morning. So we are talking about roles in church. And I know it's not the dinner rolls that we all eat on Sunday, but we're talking about roles in church. We've alluded to that they're similar to roles in government. Wow, are we not watching what happens when roles break down in government? Aren't we watching what happens? What do we call that? Chaos, anarchy, right? When correct respect for authority and law breaks down, it's anarchy. When roles aren't, whether it's civic government, the home, or the church, when roles aren't God-ordained roles. Romans chapter 13 say that God ordained the authorities, and they don't bear the sword in vain. They didn't have guns in those days. So we've seen what roles are like. Okay, and when you don't have proper roles and proper authority and obey whatever that is, whatever system of government you're under, and remember when this was written, they were under the Romans who were, he's writing, that's in Romans. I mean, he's writing to some, Nero is the Caesar. I mean, you don't get much worse, corrupt, villainous person in history than Nero. And Paul says that we are to respect the authorities that God gives us. Do good. So as we look at the church in a like manner, we've looked at, for a couple of Sundays, the role of the pastor and all the synonyms. Same man, we believe it's the same person, that pastor is a role, elder is a role, bishop is a role, angel of the church is a role. Those are all synonyms of the same guy. Others would say, no, they're two different people. We talked about that last week with the Catholic Church, the Episcopal Church. They have an episkopos. The bishop is not in the local church. It's above the local church, outside of the local church. The Bishop of Rome, the Bishop of the Diocese of Denver. The same with the Anglican Church. You have an Archbishop of Canterbury. So they don't believe the bishop is in the local church. They believe it's a different person. We would say, our understanding is it's the same person, different role. Just like I'm a dad, I'm a grandpa, I'm a brother, I'm a husband, a friend to some of you, I'm sure. Hopefully all of you. I'm joking. But those are all, they describe different roles, right? So when Alex saluted me, even though I'm retired, he knew what to do when you get a coin, even though we're both civilian. I was in a different role with Alex for just a split second. And then after that split second is over, I go back to being his pastor. So I went from being a retired general officer, his pastor, to retired general officer, back to pastor. You all watched different roles, right? So we can be the same person and have different roles. So today we want to talk about deacons. We believe, as we've talked about, that there are two offices, pastors and deacons. We don't believe that there's a bunch of other offices. Why? In the church. Why? Because pastors and deacons, that's what's in the Bible. And we say the Bible is our sole source for faith and practice. Now, can we have other volunteer positions and people doing things? Absolutely. In fact, Caleb has a whole list of all the different people that are doing every member ministry. And he's coming up with that whole list of every member ministry and what's going on with that and who's following and where we have some holes and where people get. I mean, we're working on. That's what we're going to talk about next week. Okay, what do the sheep do? What do the shepherds do? What do the deacons do? So in the text that we saw today, we read through this. My first point, if you're going to follow along with me in the notes, is deacons are servants, not senators. Deacons are servants, not senators. So in Acts 6:1-6 that we read, this story, Luke tells us that the Hellenist widows were being overlooked in the daily distribution of food. Wow. Okay, let me explain the culture. So Jews were scattered all over the world. Remember, they were like everywhere. Paul went and preached in synagogues. If you ever see Paul preaching in a synagogue, that means there's 10 bar mitzvahed males in that city. You couldn't have a synagogue without 10 bar mitzvah males. So that means 12 and up. So anytime you see a synagogue, then there's 10 males, 12 and up in that city. Okay? So they're spread all over. It's called the diaspora. And one of the goals of Jews of the diaspora was move back to Jerusalem before they died so they could be buried on the Mount of Olives, because they believed that when the Messiah came back to set up his kingdom, they would be above everybody else. Being on the Mount of Olives meant you got to go to heaven first. So they all wanted to move back to Jerusalem, and you can go to the Mount of Olives today, and there's hundreds and hundreds and even thousands of graves on the Mount of Olives that are Jewish. So when the Arabs get mad at the Jews and they want to desecrate and they get upset, they desecrate all those tombs on the Mount of Olives, even today. So what would happen? You have an older couple, they move back to Jerusalem, and they're there, and then the husband dies, and there's a widow. Well, they don't have Social Security, they don't have Medicare, they don't have any of that stuff. And so what happened is one of the parts of the tithe to the temple was to care for widows and orphans. And so there was a table that if you were a widow, a Jewish widow, you could go and get food, or the gifts would be given, and then the money would be taken and they would go out and buy food, and then it would be dispersed. And this was a Jewish welfare program set up in the Old Testament. All great. But what happens is this widow, on the day of Pentecost, she accepts Christ as her Savior. Or 3 weeks later, her neighbor is sharing the Messiah has come and we crucified him, and his grave is right over there and it's empty. Place your faith in Jesus. And she does. Guess what happens to her food allowance from the Jewish Pharisees? Guess what happens? It's gone. So they set up the church. That's what you see with giving. Barnabas gives food, right? He gives a plot of land, and that's when you see Ananias and Sapphira lie. But they're giving money, they're giving land to buy food for the widows that have been abandoned. Okay, that's what's going on. Well, we are all sinners, and even in the first church, they had ethnic division. The Hellenists means these are Greek-speaking Jewish widows that don't have family, don't have friends. They've moved back to Jerusalem to die and be buried on there by Jerusalem, right? On the Mount of Olives. The Jewish women that are widows, they have friends, they have family, they have connections. And so what happens is, as the widows are being given money, the widows that speak Greek and don't speak Aramaic feel like they're getting shunned aside. So this division, this ethnic problem, you thought we were the only ones that had ethnic problems. The early church had ethnic problems. This ethnic problem comes up, and so the disciples decide, well, they're now the apostles, there's this complaint against the Hebrews, the Jewish believers, by the Greek-speaking believers, because their widows were not getting as much food. So the 12 summoned the multitude of disciples and said, it's not desirable that we should leave the word of God and serve tables. So the word deacon is not used in this text. You won't find the word deacon here. Okay? It's not in this text. However, the Greek word that we get our word deacon is used, and it is found in the previous verse when it says, in those days, a number of disciples arose, and there was, because the daily distribution. That word distribution is the word diakonos that we get our word deacon from. So in other words, this distribution, this service, this serving. So why do I say deacons are servants, not senators? It's because that's what the word means. Remember how we've talked about baptism and we've talked about elder. We've taken theological meaning out of word meaning. Okay? So that's distribution is that. Now, these might be the first deacons, and they probably are, but we're not really sure. We'll see more evidence of that a little bit later as we look at a couple of other passages. So, and then again, the word is found in the second verse. And then the 12 summoned the multitude and the disciples and said, it is not desirable that we should leave the word of God and serve tables. So that word serve is the same word as deacon. It's that diakonos, okay? So the tables are likely where people brought money or brought food, and then they would take the money and buy food, or if the food was brought in, if you've ever grew up in a country church, a lot of times the person was paid in eggs, right? Or the person was paid in a couple of chickens. So they would bring a sheep. Here's Snuffy out there with his shepherd, and he brings a lamb and drops it on the table and says, hey, take the sheep and divide it amongst the widows. Okay, so the tables are likely where they brought the money or they brought food or both. So what we draw out of this is that there was a level of financial oversight. There's certainly a level of service. There's certainly a logistical administrative piece. You don't want to get too deep and say these are kind of seen through a glass darkly, but these kind of give us some clues. But notice they're not senators. Senators give speeches. Senators politic. Senators try to get votes. Senators spend other people's money to get votes. We know that, right? In both in Denver and Washington, D.C. These are servants. So let me give you that. The Greek word in common usage that God uses to describe this office literally means to wait at a table. So most people don't realize this, but in the Roman world, very few people in the cities fix their own food. We know that from the ruins at Pompeii. They had fast food. They literally did. And they had pictures on the walls of whatever animal or whatever food was served. So it's their version of Jack in the Box, Burger King, Cane's. And you would go and you would sit, and they had hot pots, and you would come home from work and you could take it with you, or you could sit there. And the people that gave you the food were called diakonos. They were servants. They were served. They waited on the table. It's also used to taste. That's why so many of our deacons are overweight. Because, did I say that part out loud? Ron, I wasn't talking about you. I was talking about Chris. So, no, I'm joking. But so you remember that they had people that tasted the food to make sure it wasn't poisoned? That was what Nehemiah's job was. He was the cupbearer to the king. Why? Because people are always poisoning the king, often his kids, so they could get the throne. So they always had a cupbearer that would drink, and then it would hand it. We would go, oh, how disgusting. It's your germs and all. Well, would you rather have a little slobber or arsenic? Which would you rather have in your cup? Okay, so this is to taste. It also is used in secular Greek to provide care for. In other words, to care for. So that's where we kind of get the idea of our deacons have care groups. Like there's different members of our church that they're kind of responsible for, give you a call, how's things going, or whatever, or if there's a crisis, that they help you with that. Okay? So to care for, the overall usage means to serve. That's what diakonos means. It means to serve. So deacons are not senators, they're servants. Let me tell you a couple of things I found in secular Greek. Plato. Has anybody ever heard of Plato? Everybody? Okay, here's what Plato said. He said, how can a man be happy when he has to diakonos someone? To serve someone. The Greek mind that a important office, I mean, the idea that your God died on the cross, that's not a conqueror. That's crazy to them. But the idea that an important office, how could anybody be happy and be a deacon? How could anybody be happy and serve? Now, Plato lived hundreds of years before Jesus, but that was the word tables, like I said, is where the food and money come into place. So we deduce that the practice that deacons have a role in the finances of the church, because there was money exchanged likely at those tables. There was a logistics. They didn't have a church building. They met in homes, private homes, and things like that. So that's why in our church, when we do a budget, the deacons and the elders all talk about the budget, and we talk through it, and they get it weeks ahead of time, and they get the budget on how we've been spending money, and all the deacons look over that, and they have it for weeks, and then we sit down together and we say, what is up with this? What is up with that? And then Caleb steps out of the room, and we talk about Caleb's salary. Then I step out of the room, and the deacons talk about my salary. So all the deacons, that comes out of this idea to serve, but to have oversight over logistical aspects. This was really the only logistical aspect the early church had, was taking care of widows. This was it. Okay? So as I say that to you, they didn't own land, right? So they didn't have that. Their money oversight, and then when the apostles and the deacons agreed on it, distribution was in the hands of the deacons. That was their service. They weren't politicians. They weren't out trying to get votes. They didn't give speeches. That's not their role. Their role is to serve. Okay, so that gives you one aspect of their role. Second aspect, deacons are one of two offices. Okay, if you're taking notes with me, deacons are one of two offices. Remember, in our list of distinctives, two offices. So when I go back and I teach history, and I teach people in history that are like us. So, Pastor, why do you believe that there are people like us in history? Because we're not like the Roman Catholic Church. I thought the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Catholic Church, Orthodox Church, that's all there was. Well, no, there were a lot of separatistic groups that are a lot like us. Your crazy uncle that comes over at Christmas time, or something like that. So they're kin. They're not exactly like us. They didn't do it, but they read the same Bible we do, and they stepped away from tradition and said, our Bible's and we're gonna pattern our church after the Bible. Those groups have always existed. They have. Jesus said, I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not stop it. So there've always been believers, always. So one of the things I always look for when I look for groups, whether it's called the Donatists, in the 4th century, the 5th century, and the 6th century, which were a dominant revivalistic, evangelistic group, not exactly like us, but they had two offices. They didn't have a bishop that was in charge of all the churches, like the Pope in Rome. They had two offices. They had a pastor and a deacon. So you look for that. When we talk about the Anabaptists in Switzerland and Germany in the 1600s, they had two offices. When you talk about the Waldenses, who were killed by the millions by the Catholic Church in the early 13th century, they had two offices. So this two offices idea, amongst many other things, they believed in salvation by faith alone and things like that, but they had two offices. So they had deacons and they had elders, pastors. So deacons are one of two offices. Where do we see that in the Bible? Okay, great verse for this, Philippians 1:1. So I'm actually going to share with you all the verses that have the word deacon in them. And even Acts 6, which we think that's the early deacons, but they're not called deacons. But the word diakonos is used twice in the passage, so we think that's kind of the embryonic, what became deacons, okay? So Paul and Timothy, bondservants. Well, here's what's interesting. The word diakonos is used here as an office, but the word bondservant is also a servant. There's two different words. So bondservant. I love this one. Not all the time, but it means a willing slave. Alex, Elizabeth, this is us in the military, right? We're willing slaves. We sign on the dotted line. We take an oath, and they send us here or send us there. I've asked Alice just recently, does he know where he's going to go for pilot school? There's a number like my son went to Vance in Enid, Oklahoma, and he goes, no, they don't tell us for a couple more months, and because it's going to be wherever the needs of the Air Force. You hear it in your entire career. Where does I don't like that place. Well, it's the needs of the Air Force, but and you sign, that's a bond slave. That's a bond slave. Now, often, not all the time, but often they would take and put an awl in the ear of a bond slave. So the bond slave is somebody that may have gotten out of debt. Maybe they sold themselves into debt and they got out of debt, but they were given a house, they were given food, they were given a job, and they weren't starving to death. And they said, my life is better as a servant to you, as my master, than it is me trying to have my own business. I don't have any land. And so what the owner would do, he would take an awl, heat it, and stick and make a hole in the ear. So if the slave ever ran away, everybody would know by the scar, this is a bond slave. So when I go to junior high camps and senior high camps and things like that, and I'm preaching to teenagers, I always tell the young men, find a girl with pierced ears because she wants an owner. She's a slave. She's looking for an owner, and just find a girl with a pierced ear because she will be your slave the rest of your life. And that's exactly, for whatever reason, the girls are even more animated about how evil Pastor Mike is when I say stuff like that. So, but that's the word bondservant. It's a willing slave. Here's what Paul is saying. Paul is saying, Timothy and I are willing slaves of Jesus Christ. What a powerful example for us. What a powerful example for us. And if you stop and think, when he writes the church of Corinth in 2 Corinthians, he says, I bear in my body the marks. Where that slave would get an awl in the ear and a pierced ear, he says, I've been beaten all these times. I think it's 3 times 39 lashes. I've been shipwrecked. I've been this. He gives that whole long list. And he says, I bear in my mark. I bear in my body. In other words, I'm a bond slave, and I bear the marks of being a willing slave to Jesus Christ in my body. So he says to all the saints in Christ who are in Philippi, this is obviously being written, so this is northern Greece. He's writing to a church in northern Greece with the bishops and deacons. So the bishops would be synonymous with elders. It's just explaining, remember, bishop, that's the role of the president of the college. It's an administrative role, okay? So he said that the administrative role is with the bishops and the servant role is with the deacons. That's with the bishops and deacons because that's what the word means. The word pastor here in some translations is the word bishop. The New King James accurately uses its episkopos, which we talked about last week. The word bondservant, as I said, is a willing servant. The word deacon is one who serves at tables, like a waiter. That would be a common usage. Deacons, number 3, are to be godly servants. Deacons are to be godly servants. It's 1 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 8. Paul is writing to his young son in the faith, who at this time probably is pastoring that church in Ephesus that we talk about every once in a while. And here's what he says to him. After explaining the qualifications of a pastor, a bishop, an elder, he says, likewise, so in a similar way, even our servants must be reverent, not double-tongued. In other words, they're loyal, they don't gossip, they're reverent. In other words, they're not telling crude jokes, they're not swearing. They're not doing those kinds of things, not given to much wine. They're not drunkards. They're not greedy for money. They're not, because if one of the early church things for deacons in all these other cities was to take care of widows. Paul talks about taking care of widows in different places. How do we know when someone is a widow? Well, she's a widow indeed. Her family can't help her. Maybe she doesn't have any family. And he gives characterizations of how we would help a person that needs help. Okay? Well, if you're greedy for money like Judas Iscariot, right? We read that they didn't know he was stealing from the purse. So if you have a purse and you're taking care of the church money, Paul sets up in 2 Corinthians 8:9 when he talks about giving a faith promise missionary gift to the poor saints at Jerusalem. He talks about at least 4 different men that are going to go with that money to make sure there's accountability. That's why all of our checks get double checked. We have 2 people count the money. Our deacons rotate in the counting of money. We have multiple people. My wife is the bookkeeper, but she has no idea who gives any money. The people that count the money, Adriana counts every week, and then the deacons rotate. Ray is in there a lot, or another deacon is in there, but they rotate. So that the money is nobody knows. My wife doesn't know. She writes checks. I don't want to know. She doesn't want to know. We don't want to know because we want the accountability to be with the deacons and the financial people of the church. And they give me a report, but all I see as the overseer of the workforce is how many checks, how much money came in, what were the designations. That's so I don't know, yet as the overseer of the workforce, the president of the assembly, I can guide the ship. Because if you don't know what the money is, you can't guide the ship. But that's the balance between the deacons and the pastors and how we live this out in our church. He says, not greedy for money, holding the mystery of truth. In other words, the things that have been soon recently revealed, the mystery, unrevealed truth, of faith with a pure conscience. In other words, we don't understand everything. If you have a deacon that tells you they understand everything, they shouldn't be a deacon. Of course, if you have a pastor that tells you he understands everything, he probably shouldn't be your pastor either, because there's those things we don't know. If you said to me, Pastor, explain the hypostatic union. How does Jesus being 100% man and 100% God, how does 100 plus 100 equal 100? New math. All I got to say is it was new math in a public school, I think. I'm joking, of course. I don't know. The Bible teaches it. I say, okay. I was just reading the other day about Voyager, not the Star Trek series, okay? But the Voyager little satellite that we sent out 40 years ago or whatever it was. Do you know that the computer on that Voyager, that you have what did it say, 100 times more capability in your phone than you do on that satellite, on that spaceship, because it's 40-year-old technology. It just exited out into the heliosphere, so it's out of our solar system now. And I want to say it's been out 40 years now. I think that's about right. And it's gotten one light day away from Earth in 40 years. One light day. Light travels at the rate of 186,000 miles per second. Caleb was under conviction, so he left, because I was going to say that's about how fast he drives. So Pastor Caleb, yeah. 1 light day. It's taken us 40 years to go one light day. So if light left where Voyager is right now, we would see it in one day. But that's how great our God is. So to say Jesus 100% man, 100% God, and I can't explain it, well, there's a lot of things science can't explain. So pure conscience, but let these first be tested. Then let them serve as deacons, being found blameless. Okay? Being found blameless. So let me just have a quick church meeting and talk about what our Constitution says about pastors and deacons. Okay? So if you read, so we're having a church chat right now. If you read the job description of pastor, it's just one section, which is good. I mean, it's all accurate, it's biblical. But if you look at the different words I've taught you, elder, pastor, teacher, bishop, you'll see different line items. And you'll say, oh, that's his role. That line item is his role as a bishop. He's the chairman of he's the chairman of every board. So if we have a deacon board, I'm the chairman. Literally, for the government and our 501c3, the senior pastor is the president of the assembly for our 501c3 status. And that's biblical. That's the name bishop. Okay? So we have one section on pastor. So if there's two offices, why do we have trustees in our Constitution? That's a third office. So the question is, did the Donatists, who are very Baptistic, did they have trustees in the 4th and 5th and 6th century? No. Did the Albigenses in the 12th century have trustees? Nope. They had two offices. Did the Waldenses, who were godly people in the 14th century, in fact, there is a statue in Prague where Jan Hus was martyred in 1415. And one of the four influences on John Huss who was a morning light, as it were, to the Reformation 100 years before Luther, is one of the people holding up John Huss. Elma and I have been there to this huge thing in the main square. By the way, his date of burning at the stake is the Czech Republic's Independence Day. They celebrate their Independence Day on the day the Catholics killed him because they became an independent nation, the Bohemians. Another long story. I won't bore you with that one. But one of the four men that influenced him was a guy by the name of Peter Waldo, who founded the Waldenses. No trustees. The early Baptists in England, the Anabaptists in Switzerland and Germany in the 16th century, no trustees. The early Baptists, John Smythe. In fact, Pastor Caleb and I were talking about John Smythe this week. Early Baptists, 1642, London Confession of Faith, no trustees. You say, okay, Pastor, why do we have trustees? The first trustees you find in a Baptist church are in 1790 in America. There aren't trustees in England. Charles Spurgeon's church in England, where I've worshiped, doesn't have trustees. We have trustees. Why? 1790. Do you know what important thing happened in 1789? The first Congress. Constitution? Yep. First, and we get the Bill of Rights. And all of a sudden, Baptist churches can own land and be nonprofits. That's great. Everyone who's ever taken a tax write-off by giving to Littleton Baptist Church or anybody, double thumbs up, right? The Roman Empire did not give Peter and Paul a tax write-off when they gave to the church at Philippi. Right? Okay, so 1790, men become trustees. Why? Because they have the government wants to know, is this really a nonprofit? I think we're going through that with Somali daycare centers in Minneapolis right now, aren't we? Are they really a nonprofit? The fiduciary responsibility is to say to the government, yes. So when a nonprofit incorporates, it has to say its mission. The responsibility is to say, yes, the organization is doing that mission. That's it. That's it. So doing the mission, so I founded a seminary in Arizona. We had a college. I created, with help of a team, a working board. We went to accreditation, national accreditation. We were one of the first independent Baptist colleges to ever reach, in fact, the second to ever reach international or national accreditation. So we could get DOE, we could get Pell Grants, we could get low interest loans, Stafford loans. We did all that work. That trustee board, their only job for that incorporated college and seminary was to say to the Department of Education, here's our statement of why we exist, and we're saying to you, we are keeping that statement. We are doing this job, that we keep the statement. They never talked about salaries. That wasn't their job. They never talked salaries. They never talked who hired and fired. We would inform them, but that wasn't their job. Their fiduciary responsibility was simply to say, yes, we are keeping our nonprofit status. I had a deacon once that said to me, he said, Pastor, this year it says that we are $100,000 over budget. He said, I thought we were to be nonprofit. I said, yeah, your definition of nonprofit means bankruptcy, okay? So what does nonprofit mean? Let me tell you, because a lot of people, and so I'm having a church talk right now, right? Let's just say we had 10 people in our church, 10 families. And we're going to show after depreciation this year, like a $40,000, it's in there you can look at, like a roughly $40,000 income plus over expenses. A for-profit company would do what with that $40,000? Some of you get these monthly and quarterly as you're now retired, and they're called what? Dividends. That's a for-profit company exists for shareholders, so they make more money, right? I mean, if you're saving for retirement or you're already retired, you may be living off of dividends. So Tri-City, Littleton Baptist Church is not going to write everybody a check for $500 because you're shareholders. That would be a for-profit. And then we couldn't have nonprofit status. And our trustees would be in trouble for not guaranteeing that's their fiduciary responsibility. So at Littleton Baptist Church, who are our trustees? Deacons. The deacons. Now, what we have in our Constitution is there's all these job descriptions for deacons, and there are job descriptions for trustees, but they're the same person. Most Baptist constitutions, for instance, Fourth Baptist in Minneapolis, where George's son is on staff and one of the seminary professors there, they simply have one line: our deacons for state purposes act as our trustees. Because they're the same person. You can ask Ron about being in a Baptist church that had a group of trustees and another group of deacons. And they went like this all the time. Okay? So when we talk about fiduciary responsibility of a deacon acting as a trustee, the only fiduciary responsibility is to make sure that our church agrees and does our nonprofit status to maintain our 501c3. That's it. That's the fiduciary responsibility. Sometimes people think, oh, there's all these other, no, there aren't. That's the responsibility of a trustee of any corporate nonprofit corporation. I know, I ran them for years. So that's one of the reasons, if all the pastor roles are in one section, why the deacons were suggesting to the church that we put all the deacon roles in one section, and you could have a line that says the deacons act as the trustees for the purpose of the state. Then you have parallelism, as opposed to thinking these are two separate groups with two different roles and two different responsibilities, because they aren't. They aren't. And there's a reason why Baptist churches do it that way. There's reasons for that. Largely because you don't want to have three offices when there's only two in the Bible, and you don't want to have two different groups of people that will tend to fight with each other over who's doing what. When Littleton has always had them as the deacons or the trustees. But there's really one fiduciary responsibility for a trustee in America. Do you know that there are no trustees in India in Baptist churches? There are no trustees in Britain in Baptist churches. They just have deacons. We have it because of nonprofit status. So I know I'm taking a little bit of time to have that discussion with you. So there's a lot of bad stories about dictator overbearing pastors. Absolutely. Just like there's a lot of stories about dictator overbearing husbands. Did you know that there's also stories about dictator overbearing wives? Ladies, I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
Say it isn't so.
Say it isn't so. So let me again, this is kind of a church talk on deacons. So many years ago, there was a huge church in Chicago, pastored by a really good friend of mine. Your parents have actually visited the church, and I told them the whole backstory on this already. So you can ask your mom and dad about it. Very good friend of mine pastored the church, huge Christian school, church ran about 1,100, built an amazing facility. Had 4 basketball courts, a running track around the gymnasium for the wintertime, had tennis courts inside. I mean, it was an amazing church, amazing choir. Elma and I have visited there before, amazing orchestra, amazing. It was the son-in-law who was the pastor. Large staff, 50, 60 people, huge Christian school, 500 in the Christian school, and a preschool with 500 to 600. Preschool with 500 to 600. Just a monster suburb of Chicago ministry. And 2 deacons got their nose out of joint at the pastor. The pastor's wife had come to the church with her parents when she was 1. Her parents by this time had passed away. She'd been in the church all those years teaching in the Christian school. 2 of the deacons got their nose out of joint, as well as a principal that he'd had to fire for financial irregularities. Long story short, they made him resign. A very close friend of mine, and when this was all coming down, I said, how can a deacon board, you're a congregational government church. take it to the people. And he's has a church of 1,100. He led hundreds of them to the Lord, hundreds of them, and discipled them. And in their constitution, the deacons were allowed to remove people from membership. So they said, if you don't resign, we'll remove you from membership, and then you can't be the pastor. He told me later, he said, Mike, he said, and I mean, I asked him, and then one of my best friends candidated in the church years later and then said, I'm not touching that church with a 10-foot pole for obvious reasons. The church went from 1,100 to 250. And I asked him, I said, if you had stayed and taken to the church, he said, I'm sure the vote would have been 700 to 100 in my favor. Because he said, I led all of them to Christ. But he said, I didn't want to hurt the church. I just left quietly. Just to give you an example of how evil and mean these deacons were, they gave him a lease vehicle. And sometimes churches will do that for a pastor. They give him, I don't want a lease vehicle. I love my little Honda Accord. Don't think I'm asking for anything. I'm not, but he did. They said to him that night when he said, I'll resign, they said, we'll call you a cab. You can't drive home. The car's ours. The next morning, when he went home and told his wife, we don't have a job, they called his wife and said, why aren't you in here teaching today? So I always say this, and what I did is I was getting ready to deploy. This was back in 2011. And so I asked him to come and preach every Sunday for me. And he just cried and said, Mike, I just felt like I've been thrown away after 30 years of being the pastor. And he said, I just felt like I was thrown away and none of my friends were talking to me anymore. And he said, thank you for asking me to come and preach every Sunday while you're deployed. He said, I can't tell you what that means to me and my wife. So I say all that to say, there are a lot of bad stories about bad pastors. There are. There's a lot of bad stories about bad deacons. There are. And next week we'll get to hear some bad stories about some sheep. So don't miss that one. There will be nobody here next week. No, I'm teasing about that. I am completely teasing. I love sheep. I love sheep. One of the things my dad used to say all the time to me, because he had sheep, and he would say, Mike, sheep stink, but you can't. They do. Anybody ever been around sheep, taking care of sheep? Am I lying about how bad they smell? No, sheep stink. But he said, if you're going to be a good shepherd, you have to love stink. And there's a lot of truth to that. Your pastor loves sheep. Your pastor loves sheep. So I know this hasn't been exactly what our normal service is. I'm kind of a church chat. I hope I kind of put on my teaching hat today, a little bit. So I'm going to throw this out to you. I do this in Sunday school. Is there any question or comment? We're not going to have a traditional invitation like I always do. Just, is there a question or comment that you'd like to ask? You've heard 4 sermons now on pastor, deacons. I've tried to take them right from the Word of God, to show you what the Word of God says. Here are the qualifications. Here's what the words mean. All those kind of things. Comment or question? Any question? You all want to eat lunch. You all want to eat lunch and get home to the Bronco game. I know that exactly. Vicki, go ahead.
A lot of things up. You really did.
Well, thank you.
It makes a lot of sense. It's like being a mother, being the CFO.
Yeah, of your CFO of your house.
You still are the same person. You just have different things you do. So.
Yep. Yep. And when you're having to be the CFO of your house, your role, your attitude is different than when the 3-year-old has a boo-boo on their knee. I mean, it just is. That's a different role. It doesn't mean that you're different in essence, and it doesn't mean that your essence is any different than Gene's. You're all made in the image of God. It's just we have roles. Yep. Anybody else? Yeah. Jeff?
I just want to say, for me anyway, and I think it's maybe for everybody, I think we prefer the way you preach and teach in the, I guess, maybe non-traditional way of just preaching.
I am kind of a unicorn, aren't I? Yeah.
For me, that it's great. I love what you do, how you do it, and I think everybody else does too.
Yes, we do.
Well, thank you. I wasn't looking for that. You embarrassed me now.
I want to let you know that that's good.
Well, thank you. That means a lot to me. I don't want to. It's always hard. Somebody who's good at giving is often very bad at receiving, right? And a pastor is someone that has to have a heart to give. And so when someone says thank you, I've had to learn to just not go, oh yeah. But that meant a lot to me. Be honest about it. But it is embarrassing because you know it is. I mean, you don't shepherd so the sheep will say thank you, but it's wonderful to say thank you.
And I wasn't meant to embarrass.
I know. I did. I knew it came from your heart. It was a bonus. Chad said it was a bonus that it embarrassed me. So, good deal. Any other comment or question? I know lunch is waiting. How many of you ever sat in a fourth period algebra class and lunch was right around the corner and the math nerd, that would be Elizabeth, kept asking questions about some esoteric calculus problem, and yes, that would be you, Elizabeth. That would be you. Hey, if I'm going to be embarrassed, I'm going to embarrass you too. So you're going to join me on the embarrassment wheel. And you're like, shut up, lunch, be quiet. Lunch is right around the corner. So I will praise and just